First of all, my thanks to Avital and Benjamin Behar for arranging this evening. I know it is cold outside, but I can tell you that the topic is very hot, is very, very warm. And Baruch Hashem, we have somebody to speak about this topic with a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge, a lot of wisdom. Our dear Rabbi Francis Nataf, who used to be our educational director at the David Cardozo Academy. Baruch Hashem, we are very close, and he has been so kind to speak about this very topic, which I believe is of extreme importance. Rabbi Nataf is a prolific author. I understand there's some books from him outside. He is a teacher, he's a thinker, he has been involved in many educational institutions here in Israel and in Chutz La'aretz outside Israel. And I can tell you it is very worthwhile to purchase his books. The David Cardozo Academy doesn't make any money on this, so I say this l'shem shamayim. But they are really very interesting, very unusual, and very worthwhile reading. Actually studying, because reading is not enough. Before I introduce Rabbi Nataf in greater length, I just want to mention to you that besides his books, you will also see outside my own books, which are available. Also different pages of my weekly Thoughts to Ponder, if you want to receive that on a weekly basis. For those who don't, chas v'shalom. Here are the pages in which you have to fill in your name and your email address. Be careful about your email address, that every little dot is there, otherwise it disappears somewhere else. And you will also find there in Hebrew and in English my small spiritual autobiography, which, by the way, in a few months' time we hope to have and to release a documentary on this. I'll keep you informed about this. So make sure that you get and be part of the David Cardozo Academy and all our activities. Friends, I'm actually very pleased tonight that Rabbi Nataf is speaking, because the topic tonight, why Jews should continue to ignore the Bible critics, the path from Chazal to Stanley Fish, is indeed one of the hottest topics today, not only in the general Jewish religious world, but specifically lately in the Orthodox world. A lot of questions have been asked about the question concerning Torah min hashamayim, Torah from heaven, and as I'm sure you're all aware of, the many critical comments which have been made for many hundreds of years, actually starting with a Portuguese-Spanish Jew in Amsterdam in the 17th century, Baruch Spinoza, Benedictus Spinoza. Lately, for all sorts of different reasons and because of new studies, this matter has become extremely complex, specifically in the, let's call it, the more modern Orthodox community. I say complex because it is indeed a complex issue, but it all depends where you start and how you look to it. It can also be seen from a very sophisticated but simple point of view. But it's something which we need to put our attention on and think about it carefully and to be honest enough to deal with the problem. It cannot be denied that the latest studies in academic biblical studies are constantly overwhelming us with information telling us that this Bible, and specifically the Torah, has come about in very different ways than what the official Jewish tradition claims. I'm sure you all know that Maimonides, the Rambam in the Yud Gimel Ikarim and the 13 Principles of Faith, makes it extremely clear that the Jew must believe that every word in the Torah came down to us from Sinai, whatever way, and if you do not believe in that, then you are somewhere outside the religious community. which is not a small point to make. I've spoken about that before. But we cannot deny that the challenges today are actually enormous. They come from very different departments. Literalism, from archaeology, from feminism, from many different departments. We hear all sorts of critiques being thrown at the text of the Torah, making the point in many different ways with many different colors, telling us that it is all much more complicated and this Torah cannot be seen to have come down to us from Mount Sinai. To deny that doesn't make any sense. But on the other side, we have to realize as well that perhaps such an attitude towards the text is oversimplistic, while it is no doubt something which many academic people are very strong about. And it perhaps is a little cheap as well. Not everything can be seen within the lights of academic studies. Academia are very important, nobody will deny that, we are all ourselves part of it, but there is more to this world than just academic studies and what academics have to say about these matters. I personally, and I suppose that Rabbi Nataf will agree with me on this point, is that I cannot agree with the voices coming in certain, what they call open orthodoxy today, where they are prepared to take into, not just into account, but actually have given into the notion that this Torah indeed may not be min hashamayim. This in itself, what actually open orthodoxy is saying about that, I'm saying open orthodoxy, not modern orthodoxy, because there is a difference between these two, is not for me at this moment to discuss, but it is a matter which definitely personally worries me a little bit, because there is a certain limit in how far we are able to go as religious people towards this whole topic. And it all depends. If you look to something from an academic point of view, that's one thing. If you look at it from a religious, spiritual point of view, that's a completely different thing. And it doesn't mean to say that the academics have the overhand here and that the authors have little to say in this matter. But it cannot be denied, and generally in orthodoxy the whole issue has been denied and ignored for many years, and it's only lately now that much more attention has been given to it. Also, in the 19th century, specifically in Germany, there were some very great rabbis and scholars there who tried to undermine Bible criticism, but by now Bible criticism is so different from what it used to be in the days of the 19th century, 20th century, that it now needs a whole different way of looking to all this. There is something about this Torah which sets it, so I believe, totally apart from any other kind of literature we know of. The text intrigues us in ways which you can't even find in Homer, in Shakespeare, or in Goethe. There is something about it which we are not really able to put our finger on. There is a voice speaking over there, sometimes a very disturbing voice, telling us about these matters, and that voice makes the text a little untouchable. Something which is somewhere above us, and we get a strong feeling that something else is taking place within this text. Now I must tell you, I have not the slightest clue what Rabbi Nataf is going to say about that. Baruch Hashem, because I want to be open to hear what he has to say. But I'm reminded of an observation made by a good friend of the two of us, Professor Yehuda Gelman, who in our think tank a few months ago, when he was speaking about an also topic, but also a very difficult topic, and that was the chosenness of the Jewish people, he wrote a whole book on that, made the observation by quoting from David HaMelech, the famous pasuk in Hallel, which says, Me'et Hashem hayetazot. What he was trying to say was that we are now in a different age, in a different world, where perhaps HaKadosh Baruch Hu is moving things around in a different direction, Certain things happen scientifically, religiously, which we have never seen before. It may be that we are entering into a new phase in this whole religious situation in which we try to live, and that much of what has been said up till now is indeed a little outdated, and we need to re-enter it again. Perhaps God is moving things around in a way so that we are able to see a completely new way and understand a new way of dealing with the text of the Torah and the Jewish tradition, which may quite well be that on the end we will have to move in that direction, which is far beyond what the academic world has to say, and also what the religious world has said about this up till now. It may be that we are at the horizon of a complete breakthrough in these studies. We will have to see how this will develop. Simplicity and complexion. I just want to make one more comment here. I'm writing at the moment a new book, and I'm dealing there also with the problems concerning Bible criticism. And I'm quoting there a very famous Dutch professor who is what they call a or you probably say in English, nano-scientist. His name is, as far as I know, he's not Jewish. He's called Professor Leo Kouwenhoven. It can't be more Dutch than that. Who is a very famous scientist, one of the top people around in the world today, who specializes in quantum mechanics, but in a very different way than what we have been learning up till now in university. In his world, and I'm quoting here a scientific journal, everything is different than it is in our real world. In that world of quantum mechanics, there exists the idea of, you all know about it, the wave-particle duality, where sometimes some things can be a particle and a wave simultaneously. So the same particle can exist in two locations at once. Kouwenhoven, this professor, is busy trying to build a quantum computer in which the quantum bit is simultaneously, I shall not now explain you what that all means, 1 and O instead of 1 or O. 1 or 0 instead of 1 or 0. It is this or that. It may now be both at the same time. He speaks about the Majorana particle, again no time to go into this now, which he says exists, but, and here comes the point, he complains that he can't adequately explain how it works. I quote him, "I see in my head mathematical formulas and situation comparisons, but when I have to put this in words, it becomes gibberish. I can't explain it. This is the secret covenant between physicists. We know that quantum mechanics is real, and that is an enormous inspiration for all of us, and we know that the world at large will never understand it. That creates a bond between us, the scientists. The others do not grasp it, but we do." Now, it is always very dangerous, extremely dangerous to compare a scientific fact with a piece of philosophy. Many scientists and many philosophers do not want to hear of that. Still, I would say that there's perhaps some symbolism here concerning our particular topic. And that is, if things can be both in different places at the same time, it wouldn't be so hard to imagine, symbolically speaking, that the same may be true about the Word of God. It may quite well be that the divine words which were spoken at Sinai also exist in two different places, the human sphere, on one side the human side of things, and the other side the divine, the godly side of things. They are one and the same, but they find themselves in two totally different places. And therefore, if I'm right about this, and I'm only speaking on very superficial level, then it may quite well be that there lies perhaps something of an answer to the question about Bible critique today. It may be human, the text, and it may be divine at the same time. But, and there I leave you with a question which you will answer yourself. If that is true, then the question is not whether or not the Torah is divine and min hashamayim. But the question, and I hope you understand what I'm saying, is why then is Shakespeare not min hashamayim? Meaning to say that if indeed the words of man can be produced by man and at the same time by God, then that may be applicable also to many other texts beyond the Torah. And then the big question is not so much whether or not we can prove that the Torah is min hashamayim, but the question then would be, are we able to prove that Shakespeare is not min hashamayim? That is an issue which needs a lot of thought. Anyway, I want you to leave you with this particular question, and I'm asking Rabbi Nataf to say his important words. Bechavot.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be here with you this evening at the David Cardozo Academy with Rabbi Cardozo. I think I learned more in the introduction than I hope to be able to impart during the rest of the talk, during the rest of the evening. I know people have told me that they come to these talks just to hear Rabbi Cardozo's introductions. And if that's the case, you're welcome to leave now. That's quite all right. There's only one problem with his introductions, and that's they come at the beginning. Some people are still coming in. I think Rabbi Cardozo should wait till the middle of the person speaking, then interrupt and give your introduction. It might be more helpful. In any case, as Rabbi Cardozo mentions, it's a difficult, sophisticated topic, and whenever you have a public lecture, people coming from different backgrounds, I'm a little wary. Being an experienced speaker, I pride myself that usually people understand what I'm talking about, but certain topics are more difficult than others and involve a lot of background, a lot of material, and therefore I try to be careful to make sure that the audience is following me. I hope that will be the case. It's one of the reasons we have the source sheet. Before I get into the talk, one of the things I'm going to do to clarify what I'm speaking about is perhaps to qualify the topic or the title of the talk, so at least we know the terms that we're talking about. So when I spoke about why Jews should continue to ignore the Bible critics, I guess one could ask all sorts of questions. And if this were a Mishnah, one would say, my Jews, who is a Jew, and what does it mean to continue? Right, so presumably we could spend all night just speaking about the topic. I'm not going to do that. But I do want to qualify the title a little bit. So first of all, when I speak about Jews continuing to ignore the Bible critics, where many Jews are not ignoring them at all, I guess I'm speaking to the audience that would normally come to such a talk, more traditional audience who has at least some reservations about academic Bible study, and certainly is uncomfortable with some of the conclusions of the mainstream approach to academic Bible study. So let's go to the other part of the title, and that's the Bible critics. I'm going to get to ignore in a second. I'm not going to go away from that either. So when we speak about Bible critics, there's a whole slew of people in academic Bible study, from the Vatican all the way to, as Rabbi Cardozo mentioned, feminist, Marxist, and you name it, interpretations of the Bible. So we're speaking about thousands and thousands of people with all sorts of different things to say. I suppose the question that we're most concerned about is, again, the mainstream traditional Bible departments that are part of ancient Near Eastern studies in most universities where they have such departments, or other types of departments of antiquities, ancient civilizations, and the like. In which case they're trying to understand the sources, right? Famous documentary hypothesis, which is, not only is it widely and almost universally accepted in academia, I'm told by a very reliable source, I never checked that independently, but that the largest academic society of the study of Bible in the United States, you actually have to sign on that you accept the documentary hypothesis before you can be a member of this thing. And the reason they do that is because a lot of Christians are involved in academic Bible study, and they want to make sure that the field is not taken over. But in any case, we're talking about that approach to Bible that's prevalent in most universities, which is not looking so much for religious meaning in most places, and whose primary interest is in understanding the context, historical primarily. In other words, understanding by comparing it to other civilizations, what's the archaeology, what were other civilizations doing, comparing it to other documents of the time, and so on and so forth. And with the underlying assumption that the document, that you at least cannot assume any sort of supernatural content to the text. So these are the Bible critics I'm speaking about. Obviously, there's a whole other approach to the Bible in universities, which is nowhere as large, but certainly in our circles more popular for obvious reasons. We'll speak about it perhaps during the talk. And that's the approach to Bible as literature, which has a lot in common with the way Jews have been studying the text. And even though, as academics, many of them also accept the documentary hypothesis and certainly are not coming from any sort of supernatural bent to the Bible in most cases, nonetheless, with them we rarely have the sort of direct conflict that Rabbi Cardozo was describing in his introduction. So that's who I mean by the Bible critics. And I don't mean it in a dogmatic way, and perhaps this is where I should explore or elaborate on the word ignore. So I don't mean to ignore as to pretend they don't exist and to be ignorant, put our heads in the sand that we don't want to hear anything about it and that we can't even sometimes borrow from their conclusions. The rest of the talk is really going to be describing what Jews have been doing with Tanakh and our approach to Tanakh, how we do it and what we try to get out of it. And based on that discussion, I think you'll see, or at least I'll see, I believe that I see, that there's not a lot of room for productive interaction with that approach to Bible scholarship. And this is not when I say ignore, as I said before, even for the layman, even for the part-time scholar like myself, I don't mean it in a sort of absolute, complete way that one can't accept anything that they say ever on dogmatic basis. But for example, there are people who are full-time religious Bible scholars, and for them it might be worth their while to dabble, to perhaps more than dabble, to be aware of what's going on in the field, and that they can benefit from that in their own research and studies and conclusions and interpretations. But for the mainstream, as we'll try to put together, I think it is runs against what Jewish tradition has been doing in the past. And again, here too, I should really define the term. What do I mean by Jewish tradition? When I speak about Parshanut HaMikra, when I speak about Jewish traditional Bible interpretations, well, we know there are, or the Shivim Panim LaTorah, there are 70 faces, and there are different approaches. I've spoken against, in the past, in this forum at the Cardozo Academy, against Hasidic Parshanut as being part or being a continuation of traditional Parshanut. In other places, I've critiqued even people like the Ibn Ezra. But what I'm looking at is the mainstream central continuum that goes from Pshat to Midrash as something that is explaining the text, meaning not all Midrash is attempting to explain the text or to read the text. Some Midrash is simply coming from somewhere else, what the Gemara calls asmachta, meaning that they're simply using the words in order to convey another meaning, but has nothing to do with the text per se. Okay, so much for the terms of the talk. Now we'll actually get into it itself. And I'm going to start with actually the first and the third source on your sheets. And what I want to get to from these sources is really the first ground of the process. We are involved in any sort of endeavor. We rarely analyze what it is we're doing and why we're doing it, how do we come to it. And for many people, they think of information and knowledge and interpretation as basically all being of one type. But in fact, if you think about it, different cultures approach information and knowledge and reality from very different ways. And it's often has little to do with one civilization being more advanced than another, but rather simply a different approach to life altogether. And I want to suggest, and for me, if you don't take anything else away from this evening, that's the most important takeaway. When Rabbi Cardozo was speaking before about the paradox that two things that seem to contradict can coexist, that's a very difficult concept in Western thought, right? So much so, as he was saying, that the physicists simply can't convey it. And it's interesting that for postmodernist literary scholars, they look to the Jewish tradition, to Midrash, to the Talmud, as an example of something that they weren't able to understand in the Western tradition. The idea of two competing ideas both being true. Right? Again, in terms of Western thought, that's extremely difficult idea, which on the face of it does not make sense. In the Jewish tradition, and this is another talk, I would argue that we have much more room for paradox. So with that, I look at Alasdair MacIntyre, famous contemporary philosopher in Notre Dame, in his famous book After Virtue, which one of my daughters asked me, do you have a philosophy book that you can recommend to me? Right? It says, she doesn't have a background in philosophy, just finished high school. And says, what should I read? You like philosophy, what should I read? So thought for a minute or two. I said, you should read After Virtue, Alasdair MacIntyre. And if any of you are not familiar with the book and have an interest, this is definitely an important book to read, extremely important book to read. Certainly for people coming from a traditional bent, really challenges a lot of the assumptions that we make, a lot of the assumptions that are based in Enlightenment thought that we live with day in and day out and never question, simply because we're born with them, we're raised with them. And one should not, it's funny that people think that our values are obvious, meaning it's funny when I say our values, Western values are obvious. When we speak about democracy or capitalism already has a negative tinge, but who's really opposed to it these days? We take these things for granted as obviously true, and certainly when it comes to various freedoms and the like, there's a sort of political correctness which is rarely a question. Alasdair MacIntyre is a fellow who had the courage to challenge a lot of the assumptions that we live with and get away with it. So I highly encourage you to, and part of the reason is he has a leftist background. It's always easier. I mean, I don't find myself on the right, but it's always easier in academia to get away with things if you have at least some bit of a leftist tinge in your background. In any case, he says about knowledge, he says all reasoning takes place within the context of some traditional mode of thought, meaning that one gets it from other people who got it from other people. It's not coming from this sort of vacuum, right? This Cartesian vacuum that you start with absolutely nothing and move on from one basic principle to another, but it all starts from some sort of traditional mode of thought which you got from other people, which grew out of a culture, what philosophers speak about as being situated. So MacIntyre very much believes in the notion of a situated self, and situated information, situated study, such as, and he says that this is true of modern physics as of medieval logic. Again, not to think that modern physics is so much more advanced in the way that it thinks than medieval logic. And we who study the Rambam and other medieval logicians and still have a great deal of respect for them should be the first to be aware of that. In any case, bringing it more home, the third source, Echad Ha'am, who between him and Rav Kook had this beautiful vision that unfortunately has not come to fruition and is rather dormant as far as I can tell right now, and that is to recreate a Jewish civilization. There's an interesting footnote. Some of you have read Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations, right? So Judaism is not one of the civilizations. I don't know if you know that. I think it has 7. And Judaism is not, but Judaism does get a footnote. He has to explain why he doesn't include Judaism, right? I think we're the only ones that were zoche that have the merit to getting a footnote. So that's something. And the question is, are we really distinct in the way that we think beyond the basic, he says, the basics we have. The Jews have a land, they have a language, but that they have a distinct culture. Is it really different than the lands that they came from? Or are they just subgroups, primarily of the West, but also of the Middle East? Ultimately, really being subgroups of modern post-Christian / Christian culture on the one hand and Islamic culture on the other. So Echad Ha'am anticipated that, as Rav Kook did, that in the Galut, in the exile, the Jewish culture sort of became absorbed or heavily influenced, let's say, by foreign cultures. And the return to Israel, to Eretz Yisrael, for both of these great thinkers was at least as much a cultural revolution as it was a political one. And ultimately it was to re-find the Jewish genius. And so Echad Ha'am says in this wonderful quote, here he's speaking about Wissenschaft der Judentum. Wissenschaft der Judentum goes hand in hand with Bible criticism. They were the first Jewish academic scholars. They studied all of Judaism and weren't specific to Bible. But he says in very harsh criticism about them that there was no sign of any attempt on the part of Jewish scholars, meaning the Jewish academic scholars, to controvert this axiom of Christian investigators, that the historical evidence of Greek and Roman literature is always to be accepted as against that of the Talmud and Midrashim, where the two are in conflict. While in fact, says Echad Ha'am, the Talmudic method rests on sound foundations. The difference between that method and Greek logic is not accidental, with its roots in a deep-seated and fundamental difference of spirit between the Jews and the Greeks. Put simply, Jews and Greeks think differently. And for Echad Ha'am, that means that Christians and modern Jews should also think differently. And what he wanted to do was to bring about a Jewish way of thinking, of looking at things that, interestingly enough, Echad Ha'am, who was not religious, he grew up religious, but he became a secular Zionist, he represents the way of Jewish thought as Talmudic method. Right? Talmudic method is what rests on sound foundations, and one that represents the spirit of Jewish thought. So what is this spirit of Jewish thought? Again, it's a long topic. We could spend the whole year on it at least. We're just going to spend, unfortunately, a few minutes, but hopefully we'll get us to start thinking about how this thinking has expressed itself in Parshanut HaMikra. What is it that it does, and how does it do it? So I went to people a little bit outside of the Jewish traditional world to help get us started. And in the title, you saw Stanley Fish mentioned. Stanley Fish, rather famous literary critic, rather radical one, most famous for his book, Is There a Text in This Class? Which is an interesting story, how the title came about, that where he was teaching, we'll see from the quote that he doesn't believe that text exists per se, meaning that the text is something that is open to almost any interpretation that's agreed upon within a certain interpretive community. In other words, it's not a free-for-all, and sometimes people make that mistake in critiquing people like Fish and other postmodernist thinkers, that if there's no objective truth, then anything goes. Well, it doesn't say that. And we'll take a look at his brief quote here. This is from a lecture that he gave, but I think it summarizes the idea very well. He says, meanings are the property neither of fixed and stable texts nor of free and independent readers, but of interpretive communities that are responsible both for the shape of a reader's activities and for the text those activities produce. Notice that texts are produced by reading activities, right? He points out that one can write names on the board, and that's also a piece of literature. The question is, what do you do with it, and who makes the decisions about the rules that you follow? But there are rules according to Fish. Fish goes further than I think most people within the Jewish tradition would be. Nonetheless, we'll see later on that there are similarities. Fish basically knocked off the previous school of interpretation known as New Criticism, which as perhaps might have been even more consonant with the Jewish tradition. Nechama Leibovitz is said to have been heavily influenced by New Criticism. Certainly Meir Weiss, who was her colleague, we'll mention him later, where for them there is a freestanding text that's really disconnected from both the author and, more importantly, from its historical context. Right? Texts stand independently. But for the followers of the New Criticism, there is a better meaning than another. There is one way to interpret the text that stands out as better than others. And there's really no multiple, there may be multiple interpretations, but no multiple ways of approaching the text. Fish disagreed with that. Again, for us, this disagreement is not so relevant. What is relevant is that the meaning of the text is determined by the rules of the interpretive community, and that each community is going to approach the text differently. There's no such thing as a clean text, right? People, especially in academia, try to approach a text without any biases. For Fish, that's absurd. Again, everyone is situated within an interpretive community, and automatically you're going to come to the text with certain biases. That's not a problem, it's simply reality. And so each group is going to establish what works, what makes sense, just like McIntyre said. Every group is going to have its traditional mode of thought of how to approach a given text. And what we're going to look at is how the Jews approached our text, of course, the Torah and the Tanakh more generally. Now, before we go further, I just can't resist the temptation of this quote from Robert Alter, who gives the other side of the story. Robert Alter being a very big proponent of Bible as literature, important writer, and also Jewish, a conservative Jew. But he writes about the Bible critics that, if you look at that's the fourth source, I think, that these scholars assume out of some dim preconception that the redactors, right, the people who put the different parts of the Torah and the Bible together, were in the grip of a kind of manic tribal compulsion, driven again and again to include units of traditional material that made no connective sense, for reasons they themselves could not have explained. Right? So Alter goes to town on this approach, ridiculing the sort of academic approach that makes Ashen Porach out of the Chumash, that it's all divided into texts that keep on repeating themselves for absolutely no reason, even though someone at some point must have put them together. But says Alter that these people must think that they had absolutely no idea why they were putting them together. So again, maybe that's a cheap shot, and certainly I'm sure the academics, and I've heard, James Kugel make fun of the literary theorists like Alter in just a strong way. But okay, anyways, it's a cute idea. I guess my cue to the Jewish approach is the next source, Gemara and Brachot, that on some level, something you can just read right past. But if you look at it carefully, you'll see there's something very profound going on over here. So I'll read it in the Hebrew. You can look in the English as we go. Amar lahu mina leRabbi Abau. So a certain heretic said to Rabbi Abau, Ketiv mizmor David v'ocho mipnei Avshalom beno. That as you see in the 3rd chapter of Tehillim, it's written that David ran away from his son Avshalom. V'chtiv, and it's also written later in Tehillim, LeDavid michtam v'ocho mipnei Shaul, that David was running away from Shaul b'mara, in the cave. Hey ma'aseh v'bereisha, which story came first, says the heretic to Rabbi Abau. Michde ma'aseh Shaul haya bereisha, lichtov bereisha. If the story of Shaul was first, as we all know it was, let it be written first. So this heretic felt that he had a killer question on Rabbi Abau, right? Obviously, there's something wrong with your Bible. It's all out of order. It's a mess, right? It fell, they speak about Rav Chaim Vital's Eitz HaChaim, actually, that it was held by a printer, different parts of the book, and all fell on the floor, and he had to all put them back together, and that's much harder to understand because it's completely out of order. So presumably this means, what's going on with the Tehillim, it's all out of order. So Rabbi Abau's answer to him is as follows: for you who are not doresh, who don't have the midrashic tool of smuchin, of things giving each other meaning simply by proximity, so you have a problem, because there's absolutely no explanation for this order. But for us, he says, we have other types of order, meaning there's order, possible order, in other types of disorder. Right? If you're looking at things one-dimensionally, then you're going to have a lot of problems. But if you're looking at things multi-dimensionally, then there are more than one way to organize information. And it's exactly what he's saying over here, that this particular tool of smuchin, but it could be any tool. The point being is that we're not beholden to chronology, and we know the famous expression "Ein muchar mukdam leTorah," that the Torah is not always in chronological order. Why not? Is that a chisaron? Is that a deficiency? Not at all. It gives us an additional way to express certain ideas that can't be expressed in normal chronological order. The text is allowing itself a certain freedom that is not allowable for people that think in more linear ways. And this type of thinking, in fact, is very much a human way of thinking, very much a natural way of thinking. That's what I bring out in my own book. I took the liberty of quoting myself over here. That's one of the benefits of writing a book. You can actually quote yourself. I remember Rabbi Blumenkrantz. I studied Rav Avram Blumenkrantz. I studied in his kola for a very short time in Far Rockaway, New York. And someone asked him a question and was curious, didn't know what his source could possibly be for the answer that he gave. And he said in Yiddish, "Steht in Sfarim," which means it's in the books. So the guy pursued. He wants to know. He wants to know the truth. Where is it from? He says, "What books?" So he said, "My books." So I'm also quoting from my books. So here, coming off of this Gemara, that the lack of chronological order is only one example of the Torah's human style of expression, stream of consciousness, which is really another word for natural human thought. Here I speak about as human communication, is full of inconsistency, subjectivity, disproportionate emphasis, and the like. Okay, and we know that, I continue, the Gemara speaks about the Torah being written in the language of men. That's not a concession, right? People understand it quite often as a concession, right? It's a little sloppy. Why? Because it's written in the language of men, and men don't communicate in the ideal way. But I would say, punkt verkeerd, just the opposite. That what better way to communicate to people but in their own language, right? If you go to Japan, you don't want to speak in English, you want to speak in Japanese. God doesn't need to communicate to himself, he needs to communicate to mankind. Therefore, obviously, it's going to be in the language of men, not in the language of the laboratory, where we force ourselves to think in disciplined ways. After all, what is more difficult? To think in stream of consciousness and let your mind flow, which we do all the time. Hopefully nobody is doing it right now when I'm talking. Or in the laboratory, where we're forced to focus on one thing in a certain way. The Torah is not a laboratory document. The Torah is a living human document. And therefore, it allows all sorts of interpretive freedom to the community that is attached with it, with the Jewish people. And how does that translate into actual practice? So there's an ahistoric, I'm going to go through several items. Number one, it's ahistorical, which again is anathema in the universities, at least in not in the literature departments, but in the departments of ancient Near Eastern studies, right? Ahistorical, well, what are you doing? You're just making things up. Well, maybe, but maybe that's what we're supposed to be doing. The ahistoricity, though, Meir Weiss, who again was a Bible scholar, professor at Bar Ilan, friend and colleague and teacher of Nechama Leibovitz, who is writing this in his introduction to the Bible from Within, where he's comparing Bible as literature, which he's propounding also in the academic context, to the new criticism, and pointing out the following, which I think is very profound. He says, contemporary readers of work subject to the spirit of the age and its problems tend to see a literary creation as tendentious and polemical, meant for its time. Whereas we later readers, free from the confines of that period, can sometimes see it more accurately, see it as it really is supertemporally. There's tremendous wisdom in here, such that you're actually, the closer you are to a book, the more you're blinded by the details. Right? Question of seeing the forest from the trees. I'll take questions at the end, sorry. The more you're blinded by the trees. If you step back from the trees, you'll see a forest, right? And that's what he's saying. The example he gives, I believe, is Cervantes and Don Quixote, that people connecting it to specific political issues and cultural issues at the time, where in fact, says Weiss, the meanings of Cervantes are much greater than that. I think the same thing is true of Shakespeare. Any great literature, says Weiss, that you may know less about what he's talking about. Right? Again, you may see the trees less crisply, but you have a larger picture of what is really beautiful about the trees. And one could argue, certainly in other directions, but certainly it's not something we assume, and certainly it's something that goes against the spirit of academic Bible studies and the way that we defined at the beginning of the talk. Leon Kass says it in a different way. Leon Kass is an interesting person, really from a science background, who wrote a book, who spent some time learning Torah in Israel, actually, and went back to America and wrote this book called The Beginning of Wisdom. And in it, he says the following: more than telling us what happened, the Torah's narratives tell us what always happens. Right? Again, the Torah is interested in the human condition. It's not interested in the specific stories per se. The details are important in terms of giving us meaning. But the bottom line is not the historical specifics of each detail of the realia, etc., etc. So that's one aspect that we're consciously, as Jewish Parshanut has consciously been ahistorical. It's not the rabbis really thought that David HaMelech learned Gemara, right? They knew the Gemara didn't exist when David HaMelech was around, but they sought to understand it in their terms, in a way that made it real for them. Nechama Leibowitz, it's very interesting. It's hard to see her hashkafa because most of it's just Torah, pure and simple. But occasionally she says things that give away her hand. And if you want to see one essay in the studies that she has in the books of the Torah, you should look in Sefer Devarim in Parshat V'etchanan, called A Torah for All Seasons and Purposes. And over there, she takes an interpretation of the Abarbanel, which she feels is difficult interpretation, and she asks whether he's doing violence to the Torah. Right? And she's a serious scholar. She doesn't like people who are playing around with the text. So she asks the question, is he doing violence to the text? And she answers that what he did in that particular case was meant to make the Torah make sense to that time. And she continues and says the following. She says the Abarbanel is obligated to do this, that each generation is obligated to learn Torah that way. And says each generation must view the Torah as personally addressed to it and directly applicable to the contemporary situation. So traditional Parshanut is consciously ahistorical. In the introduction to my first book on Breshit, so I mentioned that the Torah is impregnated with multiple meanings, such that there are more than one ways to understand the actual meaning of the text. Right? The God writes a text with all sorts of different possibilities already there to be taken out for different generations. So that's number one. Number two, Parshanut is about human interpretation. It's about a partnership. God writes the words, so we believe, and man extrapolates from it what he understands, even if he's wrong. And that's the famous Gemara. I'm not going to go through it. Everybody knows the Gemara of Tanur Sha'achna and Baba Metzia. You have it here in front of you. But what's most interesting is the end of the story, right? So if you look at the very end, they asked, Rav Natan asked Eliyahu Hanavi, right? God lost a debate in the yeshiva. There was a debate between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim, right? Rabbi Eliezer God was on Rabbi Eliezer's side. He sent out a bat call. He sent out a voice from heaven, go with Rabbi Eliezer. And the rabbis say, no, we disagree. You told us we can do what we want, so we're going to. And that's exactly what they did. And they said, Lo b'shamayim. Right? The famous Gemara, outstanding. Right? What tradition has such a beautiful story? But the next part is even more fascinating. Right? Rav Natan saw Eliyahu Hanavi. And he asked the question, what was God doing during that debate? And the answer was, right, I'll say in Hebrew first, God was laughing or smiling and saying, my sons have defeated me. Sounds like God is happy, right? Even though they got wrong pshat. They made a mistake in the interpretation. They went against the truth. But it's not what counts here. What counts is the human interaction to understand it as best as possible and the process of interpretation, right? It's not about finding the truth. It's about interacting with the true word. And that's what we see here. Along these lines, from an introduction of the new series of out from the Yeshiva and the Gush, Har Etzion, so one of the editors, Rabbi Ezra Bick, out there, speaks about what they're doing in the Gush. People probably familiar with a lot of the writings coming out of there over the last several decades. And he says as following about him and his colleagues. He says, if one would accuse the authors of the Gush school of engaging in drush, in midrashic approach as opposed to a simple pshat approach, the accusation would be accepted, I think, with pride. The methodology used here is a return to drush, not as homiletics, but as the reading of the text itself, closely, imaginatively, and sensitively. I think it's a beautiful way of summarizing what Parshanut HaMikra is all about. Whether you're in the Gush school or not in the Gush school, it's not really important. The point is that these are the tools. On the one hand, there's a need to interpret the text closely, right? Within our interpretive community, we do pay attention to the word and to its nuances and to its meaning and to its grammar and to its literary context. But with hand in hand with that, you require sensitivity and imagination. The imagination takes an important role. Recently someone gave one of my books a review on Amazon and praised my imagination. I wasn't sure how to take that, but I think that certainly he meant it as a compliment, and I see from here that it's a good thing. So there's a certain freedom. So on the one hand, we spoke about ahistoricity, hard word. We spoke about personal, individual freedom of interpretation within certain rules and within a certain context. And the last thing that I want to speak about is the notion of chidush, the novelty, that change, that new interpretations is something of value within the Jewish tradition. I was once confronted by a student who asked me, she knew I was writing books, and she said to me, well, people have been writing about this for a lot of times. Hasn't it all been said already? So I said, it's not possible, because each generation should be saying the Torah that it hears, and each generation has new ears with which to hear it, new eyes. Because again, the concept of Parshanut is a concept of partnership of the text as it is and as it stands, an unchanging text, but of people who in each generation are different. To suppress the self, to suppress a generation's understanding of Torah, is to destroy Torah. Talmud Torah is about merging yourself, not Rashi, not Tosfot. Tosfot and Rashi can be a tool, can be an aid, but ultimately it's about merger of self, of us, with the text, right? Such that what the Bible critics are speaking about, what we're speaking about, are two completely different parshiot. So just to elaborate on that a little bit, there's a couple of quotes. Actually, I left the most powerful quote off this by mistake. First, the Rashbam, who said in the name of Rashi, his father-in-law, that he would have written, had he had time, he would have written another commentary. Right? What do you do when you finish one commentary? You write another. Right? So he says, why would he do that? Because it says, according to the new explanations that are developed every day. And the Taz, basically giving over a drash on the bracha Noten Torah in the next source, says that we say it in present tense, we say this bracha every day, Noten Torah, not Natana Torah, because God gives us who are involved with Torah new Torah every day. Again, to suppress that, we know a Navi that suppressed what was told to him, a prophet who suppressed what was told to him, was Chayav Mita, deserved the death penalty. Obviously, we're not on the level of the Navi, and the Torah that we have is not on his level, so therefore it's not as significant and the punishment is not the same. But I would suggest that a person who suppresses his or her Torah is also worthy of punishment. It's a terrible thing. We have to express Torah, not suppress Torah. And finally, Moshe Hablutal, famous scholar of Jewish law and philosophy, Israeli, who's spending a lot of time now in New York, says the following. He says that new layers discovered in the text are potentially identical with the infinity of the divine presence. A beautiful idea. Say it again. New layers discovered in the text are potentially identical with the infinity of the divine presence. We're speaking about why Shakespeare is not divine, right? The way we learn Torah, the way Jews learn Torah, brings out the divinity that exists in the Torah. That relationship, that interaction, a sophisticated interaction that has coordinates, that have similarities out there in secular thought as well, amongst the postmodernists, amongst the new critics, among many other students of literature and of law. Unfortunately, it doesn't find many coordinates in other sections, the sections of universities that are the ones assigned with the primary assignment of studying Bible. As a result, it becomes difficult to have conversation with them. Again, I'm not saying that one should ignore them completely. There are good people out there. There are good things said. But in terms of the Jewish approach to Tanakh, there's a tradition, a long-standing tradition with certain rules, certain assumptions, and more than anything else, certain goals. We've been doing it very well up till now. And I think it's important that when you have a good thing, you don't let go of it. You don't be overwhelmed by fireworks and so-called advanced methodology. It's my hope and prayer that maybe you've understood some of what I had to say tonight. At least you have a good set of source sheets. At least the chairs were comfortable, if nothing else. As Rabbi Cardozo mentioned, there's some of my books outside for sale, many of his books as well. And I hope, I'll take some questions, but whether tonight or in the future, live or over the internet, whatever it is, I hope to continue the conversation with all that are interested. Thank you.
Are there any questions, please? Let us know.
There's one there. Yeah, go ahead.
How much of that are you going to do at the genealogies and things like that?
Right, so it's a good question. It's the question was, to what extent should study of Chumash, of Torah, be integrated with knowledge and study of Tanakh as a whole, so that one gets a larger context? And the Israelis have an advantage over most of us chutznikim in terms of that they have better acquaintance with Tanakh growing up and from their schooling. It's certainly a big help. It's certainly a very good thing to have. By the same token, I would say that one can study Chumash independently, that clearly there's a different style going on. There's a different, even if each book can be studied, well, I shouldn't say each book, but certainly something like Sefer Devarim can be studied on its own. The first 4 books studied on its own. The point is like this, that the more you know, the richer is your understanding, right? So if we had an infinite amount of time and infinite amount of brain space, then just taking as much as possible. Certainly it's a good idea to have at least a basic knowledge of Tanakh, to know where you should be looking when things are discussed. For example, we just covered Shibud Mitzrayim, right? There's psukim in the Nevi'im that speak about what the Jews were doing, the low state of the Jews in Mitzrayim, which the Chumash itself doesn't give us any clue to. So certainly there's some important things that come out, and it's certainly helpful and a good idea. Part of the answer is how much time do you have? I don't think it's essential, but I think it's very helpful and important.
Yes, I have to phrase it as a question.
You don't have to.
Rather than a statement. Would
you agree with me that instead of confronting the Bible critics, you have simply given us another talk on the traditional way that Jews have always studied the Torah, without adding anything that would help in the confrontation with Bible criticism.
Yeah, okay, so it's true, you caught me. In terms of a direct confrontation, that wasn't what the talk was about, and it's not the type of thing that I'm involved in. There are others who are. But implicit in the talk is that there's two styles that don't work well together. And by describing the various elements of what we're doing, I try to illustrate that there is not even a dogmatic conflict, but a conflict of cultural style. And that sounds like it's a triviality, cultural style. But my point at the beginning of the talk is that it's very far from a triviality. That cultural style makes all the difference in the world. The Jews have approached the Tanakh with a Jewish head, and that academic Bible studies approaches it from a different head. I'm not going to say it's not Jewish, but it's certainly not the traditional Jewish head. And as such, it makes it difficult for us to integrate that type of study into our worldview. I'm not coming to attack Bible critics, except for that little pot shot from Robert Alter, which I couldn't resist. But essentially, that's the nexus of the talk. Yeah. I'll take one last question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about Breuer's approach, of Mordechai Breuer's approach, which is not getting into the question of authorship of Torah Shemayim, but he actually uses the documentary hypothesis in a refined mode for Drush.
Right.
Really, and my question is, what is your opinion? Does it follow the traditional mode of Parshanut, or is he trying to convert a secular modality into the Jewish framework of Parshanut?
Right, it's a good question. I think only time will tell. I think it certainly has the right kavanah, and certainly he's trying to purify, or I should say purify, but elevate those aspects of biblical criticism which can be useful. The problem that it's had, so I understand, is that the people that are serious about that approach often get enamored with secular Bible criticism. That Rabbi Mordechai Breuer took a very unusual and unique approach because he imbued his particular perspective with a mystic understanding. And on some level, this is the problem that I'm facing as well, in the sense of saying that really the whole problem we have is not in the information, it's how we think. We should think differently. So someone who's coming with a mystical approach is going to tell you, really to understand my Torah, you have to understand how I think. You have to think the same way. So in theory, what he did was very positive. Certainly, it's helpful. Rav Yoel Ben Nun, who's Talmid Chaver, says that it's impossible to learn Chumash without it. So certainly it has an important place among very serious thinkers. But I think the jury is not out yet. I think what is there, though, I think that whether one takes Rabbi Breuer's approach or not, I think the multiplicity of voices, if not the multiplicity of information and source, taking it further towards the academic level, the notion that God expresses himself in different ways in different places in the Torah, I think is very fruitful and productive. I mean, certainly it's been clear to Mefarshim that Sefer Devarim is the voice of Moshe as opposed to the voice of God, which creates tremendous nuance and richness to the text. So I think there's potential there. I think the future will ultimately be the judge on all our approaches and who is wrong and who is right. And I remember hearing in the name of Rabbi Soloveitchik, someone told him, we're falling apart. Everything is falling apart. And apparently he said, well, the good thing is God runs the world. So that's the bottom line. Good night.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Nataf, for this very important lecture. Obviously, the topic is extremely broad and deep, and there's much more to be said by you about this, but we hope that people go home and will rethink this matter all over again and see the different approaches possible and uphold much of the Jewish tradition in this respect, which I think indeed is very important, without taking any specific stand on the whole Bible critical approach. But perhaps we will again, the David Cardozo Academy will again try to make some more lectures on this particular topic and drawing even broader conclusions or broader insights into this matter, because after all, it is a critical issue within the Jewish tradition. Thank you very much for coming, and toda rabba, chazak baruch to Rabbi Nataf.